Hey everyone, this is going to be a tutorial on how to use Google Fonts on a web page. First of all, just a little lay of the land here. Here is my very simple web page. Just a couple different headings, paragraphs, a list, very simple. And you can see that I have referenced a CSS file. And that is over here. And I have just a couple very simple CSS rules in here. Some group selectors at the top. So in other words, this means I have one style that I would like to apply to multiple selectors. So to both my H1 and my H2, I'm going to make the font Verdana with a couple backups in place. And then I have two separate font size declarations here. H1 is going to be 64 pixels, H2 48 pixels. Pretty straightforward. I am using brackets. I'm on a Mac, and one of my preferred text editors is brackets, so that's what we're looking at here. Brackets is kind of nice because it has this live preview option. You can see that it opens Chrome, a new window in Chrome showing me my web page. What's nice is as I make changes, or even when I just select a section in my HTML file, it highlights that section over here. And when I, for example, if I got rid of that text, if I made a change, you can see it's dynamically showing the changes in the browser. So that's kind of a nice feature. Okay, so I'm going to incorporate a Google font into this web page. First of all, a Google font is a particular kind of web font. The reason we would use a web font is to ensure consistency in the font that is used, or the font that our users see when viewing our web page. Without web fonts, we don't necessarily have full control over the font that is used on the user's machine. We can specify, like I did, we can specify for H1s and H2s, when the user downloads this page, I want Verdana to be used to display that text. So we can specify that, but when we don't use web fonts and we do it this old way, what needs to happen is the user viewing my web page has to have Verdana already installed on their machine. Now, Verdana, of course, is a very common font, so the likelihood is pretty high that they will have Verdana, but there's still a chance that they may not have this font, in which case it's going to go to the backup. They might not have Arial, in which case it's going to go to the general category backup, and the user's machine is just going to find any sans serif font to display the content. So in order to have more control, we can use something called web fonts. So with a web font, what happens is we add code, which I'm going to go through in a moment, to our web page that basically forces, when the user goes to your web page, they're downloading the HTML file, they're downloading the CSS file. When we use a web font, they're also going to be downloading that web font file as well. That way, they have the font, we can ensure that they have the font, and we can ensure that the content is displayed exactly as we want it to. Keep in mind, though, that web fonts aren't permanently installed on the user's machine. This is all temporary per session. So it's downloaded to the user's browser cache and will go away eventually. But that's okay, because you just need to make sure that the code is always in your HTML page. That way it'll download as needed. Okay, so Google Fonts is an example of a type of web font. I'm going to go over to the browser here. I just went to Google, typed in Google Fonts. That takes me to the Google Fonts subsite. There are lots of other types of web fonts. There's Adobe Typekit, Font Squirrel. I I can't even remember all the others, but there are lots of different web fonts. I'm just going to show you Google Fonts. This is what I use most often. It's very common, very popular, and becoming more so. So the first thing you're going to want to figure out is what fonts you want to use. So you can spend a lot of time, as you can see, going through all of the different fonts, trying to figure out what you want to use. I know that in my example over here that I want to use one font for my headers and then another for my paragraphs or for the rest of my text. So I'm going to eventually download 2 Google Fonts and include it in my HTML page. So let me start with the first one. I'm going to go ahead and choose this Poppins font here for my headers. I'm going to click on it to get a little more information. If you want, you can type your own text in here to see what it's going to look like. Obviously, it gives you a preview here. You can see that there are lots of different styles. Each font is going to be different. So there are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different types of bold, your regular font, different italics, different light versions. I'm just going to go ahead with the regular text, and that's the only one I'm going to include. This doesn't mean that I won't be able to bold the text or italicize the text. This is just going to be my regular style of this Poppins font. So once I know what I want, you just click this, select this style. If you know that you did actually want to use a super bold text, maybe I wanted to use this one for my H1 and the regular for my H2, you could select multiple styles. I'm going to remove that one. I'm just going to start with this regular for now. Once you've selected it, you can see that it shows up over on the right here. These are the ones you have selected. You can remove as needed, and then of course add more. Eventually I'm going to work with 2 fonts, but I'm just going to go through the first one right now. So to get Poppins, to get the code to include Poppins in my web page, what I need to do is click on this Embed tab. Once I have something selected, whether it's one font or multiple, you're going to want to go to this Embed tab, and it gives you the code that you need to include. You can see that it uses this link tag here. We're familiar with this already because this is what we use to pull in external style sheets. So I'm going to copy that, go back over to my HTML file, and you want to make sure to paste this before the style sheet that is going to reference that file. So I'm going to paste that here. I'm going to go back over to Google, and it shows me that when I want to use this, this is the CSS property or the CSS declaration that I need to use. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to save my HTML file. Now, to use that CSS, I'm going to go to my CSS file, and for my headers, H1, H2, originally I had a font family property specified, but I was using Verdana with those 2 backups. I'm going to get rid of those and instead, paste in font family Poppins as my primary option. If Poppins doesn't exist, then it'll just tell the computer, the user's computer, to find a suitable sans serif font. I'm going to save. And now that browser window that I had open, that I opened using the live preview tab, has automatically updated because I made a change. Remember, this is a feature specific to the brackets text editor. If you were using a different editor, you might have to hit the refresh button, and that's fine. But you can see I now have Poppins showing as my H1 and my H2. And remember, it's showing for both of them because I have a grouped selector here, H1, comma, which means and, H2, font family, Poppins. Remember, with web fonts, and we're using Google Fonts here, there's always going to be two components. One, you have to obviously specify the font that you want with the font family property. And two, you need to make sure to pull in the reference to that web font so that the browser knows to download the actual font file. So now I'm going to go back to Google Fonts rather, and I'm going to go to the bottom of the Poppins page. Every font on Google Fonts looks like this, where at the bottom it has some popular pairings. I find this to be pretty helpful. So it's showing me that other people, when they use Poppins, also use it with Roboto or Open Sans or Railway or these other options as well. That doesn't mean you have to do that. These are just popular pairings, but I find that these often meet my needs. So I'm going to select Roboto for my regular text, so my paragraph text. I'm going to hit this little plus sign next to it. And you can see over on the right here, if I go back to the review tab, I now have Roboto, regular, Poppins, regular. They're both selected. And when I go to the embed tab, you may not have noticed this, but this code here has now been updated. It's now pulling in both the Poppins Google font and Roboto, Google font. So I'm going to copy that, go back to my HTML file, and I'm going to remove the old reference and paste in this new reference, this new updated reference. So this is now pulling in both Poppins and Roboto, just the regular fonts. I'm going to save that. And now I'm going to go to my CSS file and add some CSS. I'm going to say for my paragraph text, I'm going to go back to Google, copy its CSS declaration. I want to specify for all paragraph text, the font family should be Roboto. If that doesn't exist, in other words, if it can't download it for some reason, if Google Fonts is down, if there's a network disruption, etc., then here's your backup. I'm going to save that, go back to my browser, and you can see my paragraph text is now using that font. This is my paragraph text, and you can also see that my list text is not. So this list text, it's not inside of a p tag, it's not inside of a paragraph tag, therefore the Google font has not been applied to that. So that's obviously easily fixed by adding the li list item tag in there. So I've got that same grouped selector for both paragraph text and list item text, have it use the Roboto font. So now that's all updated. So that's the process for including Google Fonts. Remember, Google Fonts are just one example of a web font. There are many other examples. Google Fonts has its advantages, though. It's free. You can actually include multiple Google Fonts in your document. You could, if you wanted, include different types of web fonts, a Google font, a Typekit font, etc. To include Google Fonts, you just go to the fonts.google.com website, find the font you want to use, select it. So you got to use this little sidebar here, make sure what you want is selected, the particular font, and then those styles of that font that you want. Once they're all selected, you just copy and paste your embed code in your HTML file. You're going to make sure that is within the head section of your document. Also make sure it's listed before the CSS file that's going to use that font. And then you just need to make sure in your CSS that you're referencing the correct name. Keep in mind that these are all case sensitive. So if I changed that, well, actually maybe it's not case sensitive. But you do need to be careful. Yeah, I guess it's not case sensitive. I take that back. But you do need to be careful when typing in. Like if I forgot and just put 1P there, it's not going to work. So that's why I definitely recommend copying and pasting from the Google Font website. That way there's less room for error. So that's about it. That's how to incorporate web fonts and specifically Google fonts into your web page.